reach 60 people, and we just started the recording of the of the event. Well, I'm Leonardo Ebner. I represent the CMR, the Council of European Municipalities and Regions, which is the employer organization in the sector of local and regional governments. Good afternoon from me, and welcome to this second webinar of our joint project. Before starting, I would like just to remind you a couple of house rules. First one is, if you wish to intervene, please write in the chat. Do not open your microphone unless you are not given the floor, otherwise might be a bit confused. And the second information is that at the bottom of the screen, you can find the button saying interpretation, and there you will find interpretation from French, Spanish, and Italian into English, and vice versa. So if it's all fine, I would propose then we can start. Our meeting today will last until 4:30, roughly. So welcome everyone once more. This is the second webinar of our multi-sectoral project on the role of social partners in preventing third-party violence and harassment at work. This is a project that started at the beginning of this year, and this will end in January 2023. It's a project that is run by a great number of social partners, and actually I think we should be quite proud of this. Once more, we should state it, because it was a good result that we managed to put together several sectors, actually 6 different sectors, together working on this joint effort. The six sectors are indeed hospital and healthcare, local and regional government, central and federal government administrations, education, urban public transport, and telecommunication. And just for a reminder for all of you, the organizations that are indeed involved in this project are, well, of course, CMR, but on the employer side, there is also OSPIM, and then we have EPSU and CESI from the trade union side, and this compose the core group of the applicants that are managing this project. But then we have also EQC, UEPI, ETF, UITP, and ETNO that as associate organization join our project. And of course, but this is not a spoiler for you, this project is the result of the multi-sectoral guidelines that our organizations signed in 2010. Multi-sectoral guidelines on preventing third-party violence and harassment. Today, we are going to debate and listen to some interesting presentations on the gender dimension of third-party violence. And that's a very crucial topic for the development of our project, because, well, we all know that, well, by now we all know that third-party violence and harassment, it is a phenomenon that is characterized by a set of characteristics or features that are independent from the gender of the person that is subject to third-party violence and harassment. But on the other hand, we also know by empirical evidences that the gender dimension of this phenomenon is extremely relevant. And it plays a crucial role, the fact that the person victim of third-party violence or harassment is a woman or a person that identify themselves as a woman. So today we are gonna dig into this topic, and we will have 3 speakers that I will present later on. But for the moment, I will just give the floor to Jane, our project expert that you already met during the first webinar, and also during the survey that is ongoing. And she will indeed present, well, do a short recap of the previous webinar, the one we had in June, that served to open and set the scene for our work. end of the survey that is, I repeat, ongoing. And I would like to invite you again to join the survey and to reply, because indeed it is essential for the development of our project. Jane, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Leonardo, very much, and welcome everybody to this webinar. It's really great to see so many people from so many different sectors here today, particularly because we're going to be discussing in more detail the issues related to gender-based violence and harassment in the context of third-party violence and harassment. So just before we get on to this topic, a quick overview of the last webinar, which was the first webinar held on the 15th of June, and it was really aimed to set the scene around third-party violence and harassment. So in the webinar, we looked at recent data and evidence and trends and prevalence of third-party violence and harassment, for example, from the European Foundation's European Working Conditions Survey, and from other evidence that is available, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we looked at some of the concepts, the overview of the guidelines and how they've been implemented and what we know about their implementation. And I think, the interesting thing about the webinar was that in setting the scene, we had a very interesting discussion, not only about the guidelines, but about recent trends in third-party violence and harassment from the perspective of both employers and trade union organizations. So issues were raised about, needing perhaps more practical guidance to support the implementation of the guidelines. The trade unions raised some critical issues about reductions in staffing levels, austerity measures, difficulties in providing frontline services in the context of COVID-19, and in a context of increasing aggression from third parties. And one of the things that we had a lot of interesting comments from, for example, essential services in the hospital sector about the issues of rising levels of aggression being part of the job, and people not complaining about it because it's been seen as part of the job and you just have to get on with it. There was discussions about different risk factors, and there were some interesting discussions that were related to our webinar today about male-dominated workplaces and women who don't report sexual harassment from customers and third parties. And there were some discussions about having better systems for monitoring third-party violence and harassment, having complaint systems that work, and indeed investigating those and learning from them. So that's just a very brief overview. It's great discussions we had at the webinar, and I think everybody found it a really useful first and introductory setting the scene webinar. I just want to say a couple of words about the survey, as Leonardo mentioned, for those of you that weren't in the first webinar, where we did introduce the research that's been carried out in the project. We have a multilingual online survey that's being carried out in 10 countries and in 10 languages, and it's currently online. And this is being supplemented by more detailed interviews, and these are the sectors that are covered. So we're focusing specifically on secondary schools, hospital services, prison services, employment services, urban public transport, and then those front desk administrative functions in local and regional government, and the telecom sector. So just as Leonardo mentioned, obviously the survey is ongoing at the moment. It's directed towards national social partner organisations, and we've had so far responses from just over 120 national organisations. The survey is still open and we're hoping for more responses. But just to recap on where we are at the moment with the survey, so far the response rates have been as follows: 60% have been from trade unions, 40% from employers' organisations. Over 50% of respondents say that third-party violence and harassment is an extremely serious or very serious problem. And 36% say that it has impacted seriously on the quality of the services that they provide. 40% of respondents say that COVID-19 has had a big impact on the quality of those services, and on also an increase in aggression from third parties. Prominent types of third-party violence and harassment that are reported in the survey are, first of all, verbal aggression. And this is followed by psychological harassment and threats, physical assault, and sexual harassment. In relation to gender-based violence, I thought I'd just draw out a couple of things from the survey so far. 11% say that they have included gender-based violence and harassment in their policies and CBAs, specifically focused on third-party violence and harassment. And 10% say that they've included the issue of gender-based violence in their risk assessments on third-party violence and harassment in their workplaces or in their sectors. It's interesting for us, I think, to discover that 40% so far who have responded to the survey were aware of the multi-sectoral guidelines. And I think, you know, one of the interesting things is that these fantastic guidelines, you know, we discovered that 60% of those respondents didn't know about them and hadn't used them. So that's a challenge around dissemination. The majority of respondents said that they would like to have more detailed guidance and examples of what works in practice. So this exchange of good practice that we're having through the research, through the webinars, is really valuable. In particular, about updating the guidance in relation to issues like gender-based violence, bringing in the context of the ILO Convention 190 and Recommendation 206. And a quarter of respondents said that they would like binding measures in the future. And as far as I'm aware, probably the majority of those, 1/4, asking for binding measures comes from the trade unions. So that's a summary of the findings. I'll be coming back to you later on the panel to talk about some issues related to domestic violence, but I'm now going to hand back to Leonardo. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Jane. And I think this is actually a very good transition to the second part of our program today, which is the panel with our speakers, because indeed we will be looking into three main aspects of the topic of today's event, which are, well, the first one, the ILO Convention 190. And we will have about this Manuela Tomei, who is the director of the Work Quality Department at the ILO, the International Labour Organization. Then we will have Karin van der Velhoven, who is the head of unit of gender equality at the GJUST and the European Commission. And she will be speaking about the proposal, the upcoming proposal for EU legislation on gender-based violence. And then we will have indeed you, Jane, again, but in this case, talking about cases of domestic violence and how domestic violence interfere with violence at the workplace. Without further ado, I will give the floor to our first speaker, Manuela Tomei. I see you are connected. Yes, perfect. And well, the floor is yours then.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leonardo, and good afternoon, everyone, for inviting me to this webinar, which really deals with an extremely timely and topical issue. I think that in the context of the pandemic, third-party violence has definitely acquired enhanced significance. So I will touch upon the Convention 190 and recommendations very briefly, and try to highlight also those aspects that are indeed speaking more specifically to the issues at hand today. Next slide, please. The Convention 190 and Recommendation 206 were adopted by a large tripartite majority of the International Labour Conference in June 2019, which coincided with the 100th birthday of the ILO. As you know, a recommendation is non-binding, but it provides practical guidance on how to implement the convention. Well, the convention, when ratified, generates obligations for the ratifying states. When the convention was adopted, it was referred to by all the delegates as groundbreaking and historic. Indeed, the convention constitutes a series of firsts. Next, please. It is not only the first international treaty on this subject matter, but it also provides for the first time a definition of violence and harassment in the world of work, which is referred to as a range of unacceptable behaviors and practices that are aimed at or result or are likely to result in harm. And harm can be of a physical, psychological, sexual, or economic nature. There is a very clear emphasis which is placed on the actual or likely effect of certain behaviors and practices, regardless of whether there was or not an intention to cause harm. While the convention and the recommendation provide protection against all forms of violence and harassment, the negotiators wanted to make an explicit mention of gender-based violence and harassment because of its pervasiveness everywhere. And in defining gender-based violence and harassment that includes also sexual harassment, they used the term persons instead of women, thereby broadening out the concept of gender compared to other international and regional instruments. The convention refers to violence and harassment as a single concept, but leaves it up to the states, the discretion to decide whether to define violence and harassment as a single concept or as separate concept. And I think this is an illustration of the flexibility that is built into the convention, with a view indeed to ensuring that the obligations stemming from this international treaty are indeed adjusted and can be accommodated to different jurisdictions across the world. Next, please. The convention provides for the right of everyone to a world of work free from violence and harassment. And to achieving this goal, the convention requires ratifying states to pursue an approach that is inclusive, meaning it leaves no one behind, that is integrated, and is mindful of and responsive to the specific circumstances and needs of women and men. This approach needs to take into account third parties, both as perpetrators and victims of violence and harassment in the world of work. The convention allows for considerable flexibility in respect of how such an approach is to be pursued. It needs obviously to be attuned to the very different national circumstances of member states, but in all instances needs to be consulted with the social partners. Next. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm just trying to unpack this approach, which needs to be inclusive, integrated, and gender responsive. It was very clear from the deliberations during the 2 years at the international conference that no one should be subject to violence and harassment. This was a wish, a desire that was expressed across the three benches. Indeed, this intention is very well reflected in the very broad coverage of the convention, which covers not only employees, but all workers, irrespective of their contractual status. It also covers trainees and apprentices, job seekers, job applicants, as well as managers or other persons who exercise the duty or the responsibility of an employer. And the convention affords protection to workers and other persons in the world of work, in the private and public sector, as well as in the formal and informal economy, in urban and rural areas alike. The convention has a very strong focus on inclusivity, but also on accessibility. Indeed, it acknowledges also that there are some groups and that there are some workers in certain sectors or occupations and work arrangements in which the vulnerability or the risk of being exposed to violence and harassment may be higher. And certainly the sectors that are participating in the project are indeed among those sectors in which the risk of workers therein to be exposed to violence and harassment may be particularly high because of the interaction with third parties. Next, please. The instances in which indeed violence and harassment in the world of work can occur are also very varied. The convention is very clear in signaling that violence and harassment does not stop at the workplace, but may occur while taking a rest or a meal, while taking a course or being on duty travel, when commuting, and also through work-related communications. And I think that again, during the pandemic, we have seen how with the introduction of lockdown measures and other confinement measures, we have been witnessing an increase in incidents of cyberbullying or cyber harassment occurring in relation to work, as well as domestic violence. Next slide, please. Integrated is the other objective that defines the approach whereby the implementation of the convention should be implemented. And the term integrated here is based on the recognition that there is no single law, policy, or measure that will put an end to violence and harassment. We need a battery of measures of different nature and by different actors that need to work in sync and reinforce each other. And the most effective way of ending violence and harassment in the world of work is by preventing it from occurring in the first place, but when it happens, effective protection needs to be afforded to those concerned and effective remedies and sanctions applied. But in all instances, training, awareness raising, guidance on what to do and how are essential. And I think this was also one of the issues that emerged in the survey that is ongoing and that was mentioned earlier on. Next, please. An integrated approach also means bringing together again, in a coherent manner, the different pieces of law that range from labor law to equality and non-discrimination legislation, occupational safety and health, or criminal law that are required to prevent and address violence and harassment. And of course, the social partners through collective bargaining, which is one of the key means whereby terms and conditions of employment are being set at the sectoral or workplace level, also plays an extremely important role in terms of preventing and addressing violence and harassment in the world of work. Next, please. Gender responsive is the third adjective which is used to refer to the approach that should be pursued in the implementation of the instruments. As I already mentioned earlier on, the convention singles out gender-based violence and harassment as an important form of violence and harassment that is to be tackled. And the reason why there is such a strong emphasis on a gender responsive perspective is because in order to put an end to violence and harassment in the world of work, it's not enough to address its symptoms, but is absolutely crucial to tackle its root causes. And the root causes are very much anchored in multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, on unequal gender-based power relations, on gender stereotypes and gender social and cultural norms that support violence and harassment. Convention 190 also recognizes the negative spillover effects that domestic violence can have on health, productivity, and employment, and recognizes the positive contribution that governments, employers, and workers, organizations, and labor market institutions, including collective bargaining, can play in mitigating the impact of domestic violence. And the recommendation 206 identify a number of measures, including flexible work arrangements, temporary protection against dismissal, or inclusion of domestic violence in workplace risk assessment and awareness as possible measures to be relied upon in order to mitigate the negative impact of domestic violence in the world of work. Next, please. Well, the convention states very clearly that all parties, states, employers, and governments are equally responsible for putting an end to violence and harassment in the world of work. It also highlights the fact that each of them has very distinct responsibilities, and that cooperation among them is absolutely of the essence. But the convention recognizes that, of course, employers have a duty to care and have the responsibility for taking steps with a view to preventing violence and harassment to occur in the world of work. And these steps need to be commensurate with the degree, the level they have of control over the situations, and also the measures that might be put in place will be very much influenced by the means at disposal of the enterprises involved and the organizations involved. So the degree of sophistication, the range of measures would depend on also, among other things, the size of workplaces. But the set of measures that shall be adopted include a workplace policy that has to be developed on violence and harassment, that has to be developed in consultation with workers and their representatives. Violence and harassment should be factored into OSH management systems. There should be the identification of hazards and assessment of risks, including hazards and risks that might involve third parties. And again, the process of identification of these hazards and risks must be conducted with the participation of workers and their representative. And last but not least, the information on the content of the policy, training on what it entails, on who's responsible for what, on the existence of appropriate monitoring mechanisms are absolutely essential as well. Next. Just to let you know where we stand with regard to the number of ratifications, there are 8 countries that are listed on these slides that until now have ratified the convention, which entered into force on the 25th of June of this year. Next slide, please. But there are many other countries that have either finalized the internal process of ratification of the convention. This is the case of Italy, for instance, or have already initiated and are about to conclude the domestic ratification process. Once that has finalized, the relevant authorities, national authorities, need to deposit the instrument of ratification with the ILO in Geneva for such a ratification to become effective and for that country to open itself to international scrutiny. Last slide is just, next slides please, is just a list of material resources that we have prepared, and with a view to informing and providing some insights on how to give effect to this instrument. I will stop here and will be glad to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Manuela. And I would just, an information for the participant, all the material you will see today's screen will be... Potrebbe chiudere il microfono per piacere? Grazie.
Could you please switch your microphone off, please? Thank you.
To this webinar. Thanks a lot, Manuela. I will go to the next presentation and collect all the answers at all the questions at the end of this panel. So I will then give the floor to Karen. I can't see you, but please.
I am here, yeah.
Okay, great. And well, the floor is yours, and thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. Can you see me? Yes. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. Thanks a lot for inviting me. I'm very happy to participate. I have not prepared a PowerPoint, so I hope I managed to keep your attention without the PowerPoint, but it allows me also to speak a bit more freely at this stage, because as you know, we are working very much on matters of gender-based violence and domestic violence in the EU. I don't have to recall to you the FRA data, where in 2014, over half of women that were interviewed by FRA reported having experienced sexual harassment in the EU. And when it went up to top management positions or professions such as doctors, lawyers, accountants, it was even 75%. And that's also one of the reasons why in this Commissioner von der Leyen has been very clear from the beginning of her mandate that she will do all she can to tackle gender-based violence and harassment and help victims. And that's why we are preparing now a proposal for a new directive on preventing and combating gender-based violence and harassment and domestic violence, which is due to be presented by the end of the year. Let's see what will be feasible. In any event, it's a high priority for the Commission. The President mentioned it in her State of the Union speech, not only last year, but again this year. So we hope to be able to deliver. The project is, I would say, broader than the topic of your project. And just taking a step backwards, you know, the existing EU legislation that already prohibits gender-based harassment in employment and occupation and in the provision of goods and services. So there is already a requirement on member states to prohibit gender-based harassment as a form of discrimination and provide for adequate remedies. And I think specifically with respect to third-party violence and harassment, the directive on the provision, the recast, the Gender Equality Recast Directive would definitely be relevant, but also a directive which we find is I would say to some extent perhaps under or not sufficiently known or used, but which we think is highly relevant, is the directive on the provision of and access to goods and services, which is also among the gender equality acquis. All these directives acknowledge the role of social partners. They oblige member states to promote dialogue between social partners on the matter. And we would hope to think, even if the link cannot be explicitly drawn up, that this legal framework at least has influenced, inspired, or led to the EU level 2007 framework agreement on harassment and violence at work. Now we are currently evaluating the overall legal framework in the EU on matters of gender-based violence and domestic violence. And we see that the overall framework presents a picture of legal fragmentation, insufficient focus, we would say, on the specificities of gender-based violence and harassment, and also to a certain extent at least an incoherence with existing international standards. Part of this framework is, of course, also the occupational safety and health legal framework, where work harassment is considered a risk for psychological well-being of workers, and where you have seen the new EU strategic framework on health and safety at work that was adopted recently, which confirms that workplace violence, harassment, and discrimination on any grounds, not only sex or gender, may affect the safety and health of workers and have negative consequences for their victims, families, co-workers, and the organizations in which they work. At the international level, I think we just had a presentation of the ILO convention. One other convention that we look at for as guiding our work on these matters is, of course, the Istanbul Convention, which is not specific to work or the world of work like the ILO Convention is, but which covers gender-based violence and domestic violence at large. As you know, we have proposed the EU's accession to this convention in 2016, and we are now in the very close to the European Court of Justice's opinion on the modalities of the EU accession, which will have an impact on further work on this convention and presumably also on further work on the ILO convention at EU level. Now, some of you have participated in our preparatory work on our overall directive, the scope of which goes way beyond the world of work, as I said. So it's definitely, it will not be specific, although we hope to include at least some specific provisions on gender-based work harassment, which will then also have an influence on third-party violence. So we had an open public consultation, which triggered a really large interest. I think we had among more than 770 participants or replies. We had various workshops, also with all kinds of possible stakeholders. And as I said, the initiative will apply broadly to all forms of violence. So whether at the workplace or outside, whether online or offline, whether by third parties or others. And it will cover criminal forms of violence, because we intend to mainly focus on the criminal, take the criminal law focus, but with a strong focus in that context on prevention, protection, support, and access to justice. So that's in that context that we hope to include some measures on gender-based work harassment. It's very difficult for me at this stage to give you any further information, because the discussions on this internally are ongoing. But one of the things, for instance, and I think those of you who have participated in some of our workshops in the preparations of this initiative know that one of the things we are thinking about is that certain existing obligations on information provision, risk assessment, it was mentioned already before, and prevention, that we would somehow try to specify draw these more concretely to aspects of gender-based violence, including therefore gender-based harassments and third-party violence. So of course, the role of social partners will be important, at least to those parts of the future instrument that will be relevant for workplace harassment. Obligations will be on member states, but as in several of our gender equality directives already, the implementation of certain measures can very easily be delegated to social partners, in particular in those matters that come under the competence of social partners. And we will need in any event the social partners' continued cooperation in raising awareness, encouraging the development of those preventive and support measures, and the provision of remedies in companies. So that's about what I can say at this stage about the initiative. As I said, the work is very intense. It's ongoing. We hope to come forward still this year with this proposal. It will be, the intention is to present it as a package, together with an initiative on hate crime and hate speech, all together for December. But I'm happy to answer questions to the extent that I can, of course, at this stage. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Karen. And well, I think the combination of your two presentations, from you and from Manuela, shows very well the complexity of the subject and how so many different elements interact with each other, well, both in creating the phenomenon and then also in contributing to prevent or react to it. And well, actually, to complete this picture, I will go straight to Jane. So with the first presentation, and after her contribution, we will collect questions to our three speakers. Please, Jane.
I'm unmuted now. Thank you. Oh, just a very big thank you to start with from both Manuela and Karen for your really, such essential information and presentations about both the international and the European context, and the leadership from both of you in driving these issues forward is really acknowledged. I'm going to focus specifically here on domestic violence as a workplace issue. I mean, it's very interesting. In the original guidelines, this wasn't included, and today we see more companies and trade unions really putting an effort into addressing some of the workplace effects of domestic violence and abuse. It's a new issue for some people. For some organisations, domestic violence has been defined as an issue of third-party violence, although it has its own specificities that are different from, forms of third-party violence that come from people who are not necessarily known to the worker or the company or the employer. To start with, I just want to give some definitions because we talk about domestic violence sometimes as just being an issue of physical violence, but actually we need to ensure that we have a wide-ranging definition that includes verbal, sexual, emotional, psychological abuse, and it frequently includes coercive control. And I think when we understand coercive control, about how power and control is used to strip somebody away of their agency, of their capacity to make decisions for themselves, that can result in threatening behaviour and abuse from an intimate partner. And we also know from surveys and evidence it can have devastating physical, economic and psychological consequences that affects both an employee's confidence, her ability, and I say her because it's principally women, but it's not, it's disproportionately women who suffer from domestic violence, but men and LGBTI people can also suffer from its consequences as well. But when an employee is affected by domestic violence, it's very hard to leave a violent relationship and sustain meaningful employment in the context of, for example, financial abuse or of coercive control. So it takes many forms, as we can see: physical, sexual, coercive control, financial, economic abuse, emotional, psychological control and threats, stalking, and that stalking can happen in the workplace, and cyber harassment, which can also take place in the workplaces as well. So I'm focusing specifically on the workplace impacts, and we know from evidence that one of the most important predictors of being able to leave and quit a violent and coercive relationship is the right to have work and to have an independent income. So it is an important pathway for leaving a violent relationship, and early intervention is essential. As the ILO has said, work can be both a preventative and a protective factors in the lives of victims. And in some cases, the workplace can offer a break from a violent situation. The critical role of managers, of trade union representatives, of employers is absolutely essential, because if they give empathetic, non-judgmental responses and workplace supports, we're more likely to see the possibility for somebody to stay and retain and be retained in their employment. So what's the extent of the problem? Well, we know from international data that 35% of women experience some form of domestic violence and abuse over their lifetimes. Estimates from across the world about the numbers of working women who are affected by domestic abuse at any time range from surveys of 4% to 40% of working women who've experienced domestic abuse at some stage during their careers. And we know there's been a significant impact from the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly with remote working and teleworking, and the numbers who are reporting or seeking help rising dramatically, and in some cases as many as 70% increase in reports to sexual and domestic violence helplines. What's really interesting about surveys that have been carried out across the world and in Europe is that the majority of women who are affected by domestic abuse say that it's affected the performance of their work or the safety that they experience in the workplace itself. So what's the impact in the workplace? Well, there can be absence as a result from work, taking absence from work because of sick leave. It could be arriving late and needing to leave early. There could be injuries, ill health, or an abuser might make it difficult for somebody to attend work. It could be anything from hiding the car keys to stealing the bus pass. Being present at work, but being less able to concentrate or perform their tasks, the presenteeism effects means that often they experience lower work quality and or risks of accidents at work. And that's a really important issue around the role of managers in spotting some of these signs, particularly if there are differences in behaviour or presenteeism effects at work. capacity to stay in the job, needing to leave their jobs either voluntarily or involuntarily, because one of the most important forms of control is to control, it could be relationships with workmates, it could be capacity to continue working, to move into career progression and training and so on. And then there are safety issues at work. And this is where it becomes really important to be looking at this in an occupational safety and health context, and particularly around risk assessment. So there could be risks from a partner or ex-partner, because that might be the only place that they can find somebody because they know where they work. There could be assault or stalking, abusive emails or telephone calls. And we've seen in some countries rising rates of femicide actually taking place in the workplace itself. And what we know is that this reduces women's capacities to have an independent and decent work, to take up promotion and career development opportunities, and it impacts significantly on the gender pay gap, because we know that women who experience domestic violence, and also actually women who've sustained long-term experiences of sexual harassment, don't go on to career progression training that could increase their capacity to have higher earnings. And there's some estimates to be made of a 40% increase in the potential of the widening pay gap for women experiencing domestic abuse. And there are, of course, strong business and economic arguments for tackling the problem. So what are the solutions? And I'm going to just give here some of the practices and evidence of good practices from surveys, research. I've been working for the last 10 or more years with companies and trade unions on this issue around negotiation of collective bargaining agreements, of multinational companies, workplace policies, and standards on domestic abuse. So first of all, there's a very good model that we can adopt, which is to respond to the problem, to recognize the problem, and then refer on. So, I mean, actually, that should be the other way around when I look at the way I've written that. So first of all, we should be recognizing the problem. So we need training for managers, colleagues at work, trade union representatives about spotting the signs of domestic abuse. And then we need to respond with appropriate workplace responses that are, going to help support people to stay in their work and to, have protection if they need it. And then the third aspect of that is to refer on. So, I mean, I would always say to managers, don't be the expert on this. You're not the expert. What you can do is provide for a range of workplace supports and then refer on to specialist legal advice, domestic violence support, counselling, and housing and other supports that people need. In terms of jointly agreed workplace policies and collective bargaining, these are some of the good practices that we're seeing emerging from both companies and from collective agreements around safety and support measures, including paid domestic violence leave. The recommendation refers to paid leave, and we've seen the current norm is around a minimum of 10 days paid domestic violence leave at the moment. It's quite a lot of companies now use this as their baseline standard. That norm has been set in the legislation in some countries, including we have legislation in Italy and Spain on this, and other countries that are currently in the process of introducing legislation on paid domestic violence leave in Europe. This first came in with legislation in New Zealand a few years ago. It includes things like, having flexible working hours along with paid domestic violence leave if somebody needs to attend court appointments, go to the police, settle their children into new homes and so on. It can lead to support around a temporary reduction in work tasks or work targets, work relocation. It could include financial support, which could be in advance of a salary, a loan, or a payment for accommodation. I was just talking to a company yesterday that has just introduced the £1,000 grant that is available for a woman experiencing domestic abuse and needs some immediate financial support that can be given very quickly. It could be protection from dismissal, because what we know from experiences of people working with domestic abuse survivors is that often they lose their job because they're turning up to work late, they're not productive, and consequently, are given the sack after several warnings. They've never spoken about their abuse problems and lose their jobs. And then the final area is work on holding perpetrators accountable. And there's some interesting work happening in some countries, in Sweden in particular, in their gender equality and gender-based violence strategy, about working with perpetrators, setting up perpetrator helplines, referring perpetrators onto counselling and training programs so that they can stop their abusive behaviour. But it's also about how you use your grievance systems to hold perpetrators accountable through sanctions and other measures. One of the really interesting things we've seen in many companies is, and with trade unions, is the partnerships that have been made with domestic violence organisations to help with training, awareness and expertise building, particularly around the development of policies. And there's some really, really good practices in some European countries on this. We've seen a lot of efforts being put now into raising awareness and helping to open up spaces for workers to talk about domestic violence, and then some of the silence, shame and victim blaming around it. Obviously, training of managers, of workplace advocates and union reps are really important in terms of providing confidential support, because confidentiality is one of the critical issues. And then engaging key personnel who can carry out things like risk assessment, domestic violence safety planning, so that you can have an immediate response when a concern of safety or security arises in the workplace. One of the important things, and I have to say, one of the great things about the ILO Convention and recommendation is also its integrated effects. And I think one of the good practices that we have seen is that some companies and agreements and workplace policies have increasingly used this alignment with all relevant workplace anti-discrimination, HR, OSH, and other policies in the workplace. Could be around security staff and so on. So having that kind of integrated approach so that your policy or your agreement on domestic violence isn't separated out from everything else, but is integrated into all of those issues. And then just finally, a few just practical examples that I've picked up from my research on solutions that have been developed through jointly agreed workplace policies, collective bargaining agreements in various countries across Europe. These are just a few examples of different approaches taken. So there's been, for example, training of shop stewards in Denmark. It's one of the first countries to do this work, actually, in providing support for survivors. So the shop steward is trained in the communications methods, in the styles to recognise the types of support that can be given, and then to develop and negotiate workplace policies at workplace level. There's been a lot of agreements and training of managers in French companies, for example, Renault, La Poste. There's been the 1 in 3 Women network of companies made up of Kering, L'Oreal, Carrefour, Corian, BNP Paribas, and several others, who have developed some really inspiring work on domestic violence and prevention and training of managers. And indeed, in the context in France, to bring those issues into their collective bargaining that is required on gender equality, although it isn't mandated specifically on issues of domestic violence. There's been some negotiations and policies drawn up with UK municipalities, which is very relevant to one of the sectors covered in the third-party violence and harassment guidelines, and some detailed guidance drawn up by unions such as Unison for local government and the healthcare sector. Across Europe, there have been a lot of agreements on policies in the healthcare sector itself. And one that I just picked out as I just thought was a fabulous example was a confidential support service that was set up, was jointly negotiated by the union and the employer in one of the big Belfast hospitals, where they set up a confidential support service as part of their policy on domestic violence, so that nurses, doctors, trade union representatives, any employee could volunteer to be a named person who somebody could go to talk to confidentially and to get some confidential information and support. a couple of years ago, I was trying to follow up on how many people they had supported, and they said, I'm really sorry, we can't tell you because it's confidential. So they don't even record the number of cases that are reported because they want to keep and maintain that confidentiality, or they do know that there have been a large number of supports given. The European Transport Federation, for example, has drawn up guidance for transport unions and employers on integrating domestic violence into workplace policies, including safety planning, OSH risk assessment, and in workplace policies. And there's been many examples in Spanish companies and Spanish local authorities and government of paid leave and financial support given through workplace protocols. And that's partly to do with the very progressive legislation that exists in Spain that has really led on this in Europe. And then we've seen, interestingly, in Italy, an increased amount of integration of domestic violence into recent agreements. And this is partly because there's a law in Italy on this now, the Jobs Act that dates back to, I think it's 2016, but that the unions then took up as a bargaining issue. So, for example, I mean, just to give you one example, was that the 2020 agreement with Vodafone on wellbeing at work included 15 paid days leave for a victim of domestic violence, along with other COVID-19 support measures. And I thought it was really interesting because this wasn't a specific collective bargaining agreement on just domestic violence or indeed on violence and harassment. It was about wellbeing at work, and it was seen as being part of this. So I think it's interesting to see how domestic violence can come in through OSH, wellbeing at work, anti-discrimination, gender equality, violence and harassment, and other routes. Then just finally, just to put up the wording from both ILO Convention 190 and Recommendation 206. And I have to say, it was such a major breakthrough for the ILO to recognize that domestic violence, and here's the preamble noting that domestic violence can affect employment, productivity, health and safety, and that governments, employers and workers' organizations and labour market institutions can help to recognize, respond to and address the impacts of domestic violence. It's a really profound statement, and I think will make a really significant contribution to our laws in Europe in the future. And what the convention does is to recognise the effects of domestic violence as far as practical and how they mitigate in the world of work. And then Recommendation 206 makes a list of some suggestions and recommendations of mitigating risk, policies for mitigating the risks of domestic violence. And I mentioned leave for victims of domestic violence, flexible work arrangements, temporary protection against dismissal, inclusion of domestic violence in workplace risk assessments, referral system for public mitigation, so that's referral on to domestic violence organisations, and then awareness raising about the effects of domestic violence. So we were very keen to bring this issue into the third-party violence and harassment guidelines because, at one level you could argue that this is the impact of a third party, although, as I mentioned before, it's really important that we recognise the specificities of domestic violence. Very happy to take any questions and also to ask, do you have any good practices you'd like to share with us? Do get involved in the project, send us your case studies, participate in the online survey. This is just to show you the online survey links in English. There's a QR code for each language version. And my email address is there. So if you do have any, and indeed the other steering group members, if you do have any specific examples of good practice that you want to send on to us, please contact me directly. I will be doing more detailed follow-up interviews during the course of the project, and we will be looking at various other themes in the webinars. And in fact, I mentioned quite a bit OSH and risk assessment, as indeed did Manuela. Our next webinar is actually going to be on the theme of occupational safety and health and risk assessment. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Jane. It was indeed very, very interesting. And as the time is running, I will open the floor for questions and actually recall to the participant your invitation to share good practices or national examples, as indeed the three speakers we just listened to, they all they all mention several times the role of social partners in tackling this issue. So I guess among the participants, we might have some good cases. I already see one person who is asking the floor, is Rossella Benedetti from WIL, the Italian trade union. So Rossella, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for both presentations. They were very interesting. I just wanted to add an information to the last one. I'm coming from the education sector, public sector. And in the last renewal of the collective agreement for the public sector in the education, higher education, and health sector, we introduced a month paid leave for victims of violence. So that was a big success, a huge achievement for us. And that was the first time a collective agreement included a reference to violence in general, to victims of violence, acknowledging the right to have a paid leave and even to be facilitated in the mobility from one place to another in the same sector, in the same administration, in order to escape stalkers and violent partners or other risks. So we achieved that already 3 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you. Any reaction on this? Okay. Well, I'm looking at the chat, for instance. Simone is asking, could the speaker please confirm that she also referred to the health sector?
We have a collective agreement in Italy that is separating the public sectors in let's say categories, and all the workers, so the doctors and all the workers in the health sector included in the same category. Where the education and university and research is included, have discussed and agreed on the renewal of the agreement 3 years ago, and we have almost the same provision.
You were done, Rossella, because I think at a certain point I lost you. Okay, sorry. Okay. Well, I'm looking at again at the participants, and I see Nadia, who's asking for the floor. Please, Nadia.
Thanks to our chair, and thanks to the speakers. Nadia Salson from EPSU. It's a quick question, albeit perhaps a bit more difficult to the European Commission, Karen. I mean, our two speakers from the ILO, Manuela, and the project researcher, Jane Pillinger, and you did also partly, Karen, emphasize the importance of integrating violence, of course, third-party violence, but also domestic violence in occupational health and safety. And of course, which obviously means a strong role for trade unions. I was just wondering, you said, and of course, you're not going to divulge the content of the pending directive, but you did say that there will be provisions regarding the workplace. And I was just wondering whether you would already know whether the intention is indeed to have provisions regarding domestic violence. And I think it would be quite, obviously quite interesting in terms of dynamics, given, here we have this multi-sectoral project involving, as you know, many sectoral social partners. And although we don't know yet whether and how we will update the guidelines, we could really see, and that dynamics between, which is often extremely productive when the Commission is ready to take a legislative initiative, and when social partners are also keen on building upon legislation, or indeed, in some cases, producing social norms. So I was just wondering, Karen, if you had any, if that intention to include the workplace could translate into something concrete regarding how to prevent or at least raise awareness on domestic violence. And another question, we did have indeed an informal consultation of social partners with your services a couple of months ago. And I was wondering whether you have any reports or sort of analysis of that informal consultation with social partners. And I believe that at that, actually attended that meeting, and a few of us already, mentioned, underlined, how useful it would be if the Commission would take a proactive role in this area. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. As I said, it's difficult. Yeah, it's difficult to say exactly what will be in our proposal. I think we would like, to include some specific measures on work-related and workplace violence and harassment. The scope, mainly our starting point from the scope, and that's how it was expressed by the president of the Commission, and is in our gender equality strategy, is actually the scope of the Istanbul Convention. Yeah, so that's the aim is to achieve the same objectives as the Istanbul Convention in the European Union. As we know that not all member states have acceded to the Istanbul Convention, the EU has not yet acceded, and it doesn't look, at least in the short term, that all member states at least will accede to the Istanbul Convention. So that's our starting point. Now there are, in this Istanbul Convention is very general, it covers gender-based violence and harassment and domestic violence, so it will include also domestic violence, I can say that. It doesn't include these some specific elements are missing in the Istanbul Convention, which is the work-related, which is covered in the ILO Convention, and some others that we want to cover, like specific cyber online violence, both gender-based generally and domestic. So that all I can say. Now, whether or not there will be specific measures on gender-based or workplace or harassment or violence at work in general, I hope at least that this initiative will help creating the dynamics or stimulating the dynamics that you're referring to, so that it will also, because it will have this broad scope, it will be just as relevant for the matters you're dealing with. than the other matters that are covered, that will be covered in our directive. So I hope they will create, or will at least contribute to creating these dynamics, that it will be a trigger for social partners when working on all these matters to also be inspired by the measures that we will foresee, because many of the measures, many of the support that we will hope to foresee, the general support, the more specific support, will be relevant also beyond the workplace. So and I hope in the future, I don't know how in the end it will look like, but even if we have specific measures, it will be easier, of course. If we don't have specific measures, I nevertheless hope that these will serve as general measures. They will also be relevant for work on gender-based violence and harassment at the workplace. So I cannot be more specific at this stage. We do our best to try to put in some triggers on this in the future instrument. But as you can imagine, there are these many perspectives which are not easy to grasp if you want to create a holistic instrument at EU level. You have the criminal law perspective, you have the equality perspective, you have the social and the workplace perspective. You have so many different perspectives, and you work within the limits of EU legal framework. That doesn't make it easy, but we hope to capture as many as we can.
Thanks. I see we have another question from Alan Lofthouse. Could you please introduce you and also tell us from what organization you are from? Thanks.
Thank you very much. My name is Alan Lofthouse. I work with Unison, the trade union in the UK that was mentioned by Jane in her presentation. It's my first meeting, so I'm sorry if I raise things that have already been raised. I just wanted to talk about a survey that we did of nurses in the UK, and particularly about the sexual harassment and levels of sexual harassment directed towards them. And it showed, as you would probably expect, worryingly high levels of sexual assault in various forms against mostly female nurses, but not wholly female nurses. And what was interesting in the themes that came out of the survey, that when we looked at what people were saying, is that people had a concern about reporting violence to their employer because nothing will be done, because they might be isolated by their colleagues, or there might be gossip, or they didn't know who to report to. And also the impacts, it's similar to the ones that Jane described around domestic violence, in that it affects their performance, it gives them stress, anxiety, and depression, and their relationships out of work are affected. And I think maybe the most difficult thing, and this maybe is following on from what Karen was saying about how you bring something in that's meaningful, is actually that it's the workplace culture that's the most difficult thing for them to overcome, because people either don't treat it seriously, it's laughed off, or I think more worryingly is that people are told that this is just part of the job, that if you're a nurse, you can just expect a level of sexual harassment. So at a high level, everyone would say we wouldn't expect nurses to be victims of sexual assault. But at a workplace level and a line manager level, that dissolves into a sort of society's normalizing inappropriate touching or sexual violence towards women. And I don't know if any thinking's being done around tools that could help trade unions and employers through social partnership look at changing that cultural perspective to make it less acceptable, to give confidence to people reporting. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alan. I see Karen raise her hand. I don't know whether it's to reply to Alan.
Yes, thank you. No, it's just because I realized I forgot to reply to the second question that was put forward before on the results of our consultation activities. Yes, these will be published. I'm not quite sure whether the results of the open public consultation have already been published. We are in the process of publishing these, but also all the others are summarized and will figure in an annex to our impact assessment. So we are preparing an impact assessment, and they will be included there. Yeah.
Thanks. Manuela, please.
Sorry, I don't know why, but I can't raise my hand. Yeah, just to respond very quickly to the question, very important question raised by Alan. I think that the answer is summarized in one word, which is again an integrated response. I think there is no single measure that will make the trick. But it's indeed acting simultaneously on various fronts. It's obvious that you need a policy at the workplace which says in unambiguous terms that certain behaviors will not be tolerated, and that they may be subject to, sanctions. At the same time, it's very important to indeed raise awareness. Because very often, and this of course depends on different settings, culture is very often used as a pretext for allowing certain behaviors to remain, unabated, is indeed to be very clear in terms of what is appropriate and what is completely inappropriate, abusive, and not to be tolerated. It's also very important to, besides awareness raising, training, etc., to have a system in place. I mean, a system in which indeed people know that we'll be able to report to someone and that they can be confident that indeed the information that they will share with them will be treated in a confidential manner. So there should be trust. And then there should be trust not only in terms of exposing your perceptions about, am I actually reading this behavior in the appropriate way, or am I making a big fuss about it, or and at the same time knowing that when to identify a number of stepped processes. So one can be just a conversation, getting some clarity, sharing of, and then the second step, when and if indeed the facts that have been shared are serious enough to indeed require some more concrete and specific follow-up. It's very important to also have the certainty that if you raise an issue, it will be followed upon, because otherwise the credibility of the whole system will collapse. So just to say, it's really a combination of things. So but you have to start somewhere, right? So yeah, thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thanks. And by the way, I wanted also to recall your attention on the fact that my colleague Simone just put in the chat the link to the survey that Alan was mentioning. And I will also give the floor to Simone, who is asking for it, please.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Simone Morse, and thank you for the introduction. I'm the policy officer for HOSPIM, the European Hospital and Healthcare Employers Association. And also following up and also hopefully answering the question from Alan and what are the concrete tools, etc. I actually would like to direct you to our multi-sector guidelines on third-party violence that we're currently discussing, because if you can see in Article 5, it actually outlines a suitable policy framework for an employer, which is underpinned by, and I think it's at least 8 different steps or even more. So it is indeed already there, but of course, the whole purpose of this project is to see whether it's still appropriate. But as also was mentioned by the representative from the ILO, of course, it's the start. The problem is to actually start, right? So, but I hope that if you look again, and I post this later on in the chat, to have a look exactly on the different specifications within the guidelines, that already helps you to work a bit on this issue. And that's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Please, Jane.
I just wanted to follow up on what Manuela was saying, because actually from, I've been reviewing lots of different surveys and I've been involved in surveys myself on, reporting on sexual harassment. And one thing that's very clear, most companies, the public sector, large organizations have policies on sexual harassment. They have all the procedures in place. They have the possibility for informal, formal resolution. And the question is, why are people not reporting sexual harassment when we know that sexual harassment is at a very high level? And it comes down to the question of trust. If people feel that they don't trust the process that's in place, however good it might be, they're not going to report sexual harassment, or indeed even talk about something like domestic violence. So I think this is why joint approaches and training and awareness raising are absolutely critical to this, because one of the problems we've seen in several European countries, we've seen it in the USA, is that there's a culture of reporting where somebody is paid off with a non-disclosure agreement, or commonly they're called gagging orders in some cases. So you're never able to bring that learning into the organization about how they can change those processes, deal with abusive relationships in the workplace. So it's the first thing I wanted to say. And the second thing is it's directed to both Manuela and Karen, because I think it's really interesting that we have, two international organizations here who are doing groundbreaking work on gender-based violence. And I wanted to say to Karen, I think that, it's just great to see this possibility of new legislation on gender-based violence. However, it concerns me that if the framework is just about the Istanbul Convention, we're really going to limit the possibility to do something about serious problems about gender-based violence in the world of work, and particularly the impacts of domestic violence in the world of work as well. Because as brilliant as the Istanbul Convention is, it's integrated, it's comprehensive, it doesn't deal with the workplace. I mean, it refers briefly to private sector having a role in raising awareness, but it doesn't put more responsibilities, or it doesn't make recommendations for very concrete world of work recommendations. So the thing that seems really interesting to me, we're having a conversation here with Manuela, we have really a fantastic integrated, comprehensive, gender responsive framework in ILO Convention 190. Most member states in Europe have committed to ratify the convention. Hopefully at some stage, if we can get over the problem of some member states opposing it, the EU will accede to the ILO Convention. Would this not be the excellent opportunity to be integrating the framework of Convention 190 into the new, the gender-based framework of Convention 190 into the framework of the new EU legislation on gender-based violence, and therein make it possible to bring in issues related to, for example, domestic violence at work and the introduction of the right to paid leave. And I say this because many countries are now discussing laws to introduce the right to paid leave into their own laws. And I just think that if we could get this into European legislation and use the framework of Convention 190 and the recommendation as well, I think this would be just a fantastic opportunity to be really Europe leading the way on this issue.
Well, I would expect then, I mean, I don't want you to oblige you, but I would expect then a reaction from Manuela, from Karen. Manuela? Oh.
Yes, well, I mean, we have been certainly, we have regular meetings at the high level between the European Commission and the ILO, at least once a year. And this particular issue was indeed raised in our last meeting, which took place in October of 2020. In which from the side of the European Commission, there was indeed the recognition, well, first of all, the European Commission supports the ratification of Convention 190. and it has been quite vocal in terms of indeed trying to advance the ratification within the system. First thing. Second thing, since they indeed recognize the value addition of this convention and the relevance to the draft directive they are working on, they had indeed said that the convention would be a reference because indeed it would be extremely worrisome if the new directive on gender-based violence and domestic violence would put the bar below the Convention 190. So, I mean, there is a very, I would say, very strong reason for indeed both organizations to really work in sync with a view to ensuring that there is some coherence, some policy coherence in everybody's interest, because of course the EU member states are ILO's member states as well. And we cannot be speaking different languages in different international setups. So, I mean, this is to say the conversation is ongoing. We have been participating, colleagues of mine have been participating in meetings that have been organized by the European Commission with a view to getting some, insights, clarifications, etc., in view of the preparation of the directive. But I would somehow, I would tend to agree with Jane. I think that we should be dealing with gender-based violence and harassment in whatever sphere, in whatever, at work, on the streets, in the family, in the community, etc., as indeed a structural problem that if we want to tackle in an effective manner, we need to acknowledge that this violence and harassment at work, it cannot be delinked from violence and harassment happening at home or happening on the street or in the parliaments. I mean, they are all the faces of the same ugly phenomenon. And while this is much more difficult to tackle in practical terms, I think that having a stronger recognition of violence, gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work would also have the value addition of bringing in more strongly the key actors and institutions that indeed can operate. So I'm talking not only of the social partners, I'm talking also of other labor market institutions that can play an important role. So with a view to maximizing the impact, this is a unique opportunity and we cannot waste such an opportunity, especially after all what we have learned during the pandemic. Thank you.
Yes, if I can supplement, I think, of course, our dream, as in our gender equality work at EU level, our aim is to bring forward as much as possible a directive which is all encompassing, in the sense that it covers all forms of gender-based violence, all forms of and domestic violence across all areas. I know your area is particularly area of the world of work. There are other areas out there as well that we are looking at. We're looking at anti-trafficking. We are looking at asylum. We are looking at cybersecurity. So once you start looking at gender-based violence and domestic violence, you enter into all these areas, and that you will see in our fitness check. Our fitness check or evaluation covers we have tried to highlight all those relevant pieces and sectors that have to do with gender-based violence and domestic violence. Now, the difficulty is, after that, to bring this all together in one single legal framework, because you know how the EU works, how we work, and we are constrained on legal basis. Yes, if we take a legal basis related to gender equality, it has certain consequences. If we take a legal basis relating to criminal law, it has certain consequences. So we have to work within this kind of constraining legal framework, trying to be as holistic as we can. Yeah, you see, so it's really not easy. So the political mandate has been indeed implement in the EU, achieve the results of the Istanbul Convention. Yeah, of course, in the meantime, ILO Convention came by, and we would like to, as much as possible, have this broad approach to those two conventions, which for us are both leading in terms of at the international level. But it simply is not easy in the way the EU works. Yeah. So we will try to do as much as we can, but perhaps in the end we'll need different instruments at a certain point in time, you know, to realize everything we want to realize. So so that's the constraints in which we work. And I think Manuela has said it, we have participated very intensely in the negotiations of the ILO Convention. We definitely support the ILO Convention. We've indeed recommended to member states to accede, to ratify, and we still hope that this will go on. But yeah, I definitely see your call and know that on our side we would like to do as much as we can to progress. We know how this upcoming directive can bring a trigger action on the part of many fronts. As I said, the current idea is, or the current intention is to base it on criminal law legal basis, which has certain limits, which we still hope to overcome, which we're working on very hardly. And I hope, well, even whatever will come out will nevertheless bring about sufficiently the triggers that can also trigger work at the workplace. But matters like paid leave, for instance, it's a matter we know has been raised in the consultations. It's something that I think we definitely would support very hard, but at this stage, I doubt, for instance, that a measure like this we will be able to adopt. Yeah, even though we see the benefits, we see how good it would be. Let's see. The discussions are still ongoing, but I don't know whether our current legal basis will allow us to go into that direction. However, some other provisions, including somehow recognizing that even in the prevention, the protection of victims, employers do have a role to play, or actors in general in the labor market do have a role to play, is something that I hope we can realize. But yeah, to be seen.
Yes, thanks a lot. And actually, I would like to start introducing another concept, another part of our webinar of today, because I think we are slowly shifting into the next session of the webinar, which is the one about the updates of the potential updates of the guidelines. But indeed, as we can see, everything is interconnected. So, well, new initiatives from, for instance, the European Commissions are not disconnected and independent from what we could do as social partners at European level. And so I would like to remind you that one of the purposes of the goals of this project is to look into the phenomenon, and in order to understand whether there is room for maneuver, and to whether it's appropriate to update our guidelines. Roughly speaking, we know that it's a good document and it works well, but we are also discovering that many elements 10 years ago it was impossible to foresee, even to imagine. So introducing this element and this overall question to all participants, I will invite each of you to have a say, to speak, to ask any question. I also invite the three speakers to stay with us during this second part of the webinar, and if they're willing to join, to reply, react, that would be great. So having this in mind, I see we have already two people who are asking for the floor. The first is Charlotte Ildtoft. I'm sorry. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. I talked to Simone before this, so I hope I will have a little presentation of how we do in practice in my workplace. My name is Charlotte Ildtoft. I work as an HR consultant in the capital region of Denmark. And I also work as a project manager within the company's implementation service. Today, I thought actually I had to make a presentation without what you call it, without the slides, but I hope it's okay that I talk for about 3 minutes and talk about the prevention work that we're doing. Is that okay? Okay, perfect. Yeah, I will talk about the work done in the organization, and especially in the workplace for mental health services. Yeah, I will just short present the organization. It's I work in it's the healthcare business. It's primarily hospitals. Our workplace is about 40,000 employees, and we have 6 hospitals and then a big mental health services. Yeah, we're covering about 1.6 million inhabitants in the capital region in Copenhagen. Yeah. In the prevention work, we work with guidelines, also against harassment and prevention violence. We have a registration of course, accidents and incidents of violence, and we also have the employee surveys where we especially ask about if you are harassed in bullying, in unwanted sexual attention, threats of violence, and physical violence. And we've asked those questions for we do it every 3rd year. We have done it for like 10 years now. And the development in those questions has been that we were more focused on actually where did the violence occur in the workplace, at your home address, in public during working hours, and public outside working hours. And that's a point because they changed the law in Denmark, so you are insured also if the violence occur after work, after working hours. So that changed how we are as obliged to as a what you call that we have to make sure that the employees also are secured after work, if it's related to work, the things that occur. Yeah, we also ask if you have told your manager about the things here, if you have experienced that the workplace has followed up on the issues, and also if you all still experience, especially, for example, unwanted sexual attention. And that's why because the organization, they want to be sure that it's taken care of all the problems. So we want to check in if something actually is taken care of, if it's occurred. Yeah, and you talked about the COVID incidents, and actually we have the results in March as this year, and actually bullying was decreased from 10% of the employees to 6%. Unwanted sexual attention was decreased from 4% to 2%, and the threats of violence were decreased from 12% to 8%. And physical violence wasn't that decreased, just from 7 to 6%. But actually, so we didn't notice the picture the other speakers talked about. Actually, it was the opposite. Yeah, that was one key point. We work with, as I talked, we worked about, we have all those guidelines, as also you told about, we're doing the, that's totally unacceptable about harassment and violence and so on. And we make the we have those mainframe guidelines which all the workplaces have to implement and make them more practical. And I want to talk about 3 things that the health services are working with. It's a very small corner of this prevention work, but maybe you will find it interesting, at least. Yeah, they have like this guidelines. Of course, they're still working with prevention, educating the employees in prevention, but they have also those guidelines like called nice to know. It's more like an action card, how to react. And they have been doing it. They have a lot of those, but they made 2, one about social media and one about experience violence after work. And about the social media, they have like those 10 good advices. I will not talk you through all of them, but it's very practical. It's very, yeah, I think we could all use them. It's like a close your profile instead of open profile on your Facebook. In a relation to patients and relatives, be professional in the contact, and that's not on the social media. Don't answer contacts on social media, instead guide them within the next face-to-face conversation, how to get in contact with the workplace. And if take a copy of the inquiry if you feel harassed, and contact and talk to a manager. That's also a guideline. And also telling that you're not friends with the patients or relative or former patients, if the only connection is what you got from the work. And also all the time contact your manager or your what you call labor representative if you're experience an uncomfortable situation in the social media action. Yeah. And the other one about worth knowing outside the working hours, when you have, if you have a patient or relative that make a connection, physical or digital, if you feel harassed, you are obliged to give knowledge to a manager. Always you have to talk to a manager, and also consider if the episode should be reported as an accident or an incident, and also if it's very rough incidents, the police should be contacted. And we also have this possibility that you could seek professional help in private consulting if it's needed. Yeah. And then I have this the last one I want, and maybe it's a cultural thing. They have made those what do you call it? They call it dialogue cards. It's meant to be a tool to get some talks about difficult subjects, to create a fundament for the workplace in the way to prevention harassment. And I have all those cards. It's like 40 cards, but I will talk to, but I will read for them, and then my presentation is over. Okay, this is one dilemma. 2 colleagues talk about a funny video that was shared in the colleague Facebook group yesterday evening, but only a few members in the workplace are members of this Facebook group. And then the questions are, what do you think about it? What are you saying? What are you doing? And what is the situation a part of? And then it's an invitation to make a dialogue about those things. Another dilemma could be you're listening to a colleague talking very hard with a high voice to another colleague about a work issue, and it's not for the first time that you're witnessing this episode. That was the second. Then it's about harassment. Some colleagues think the debate about sexism and harassment is not an issue. They say in our position, our age, it must be a positive thing to have attention from the other gender. And then there's still what you think about it, what you're saying, what you're doing. And the last one here, You have a colleague who often talks about personal comments, and many of them have sexual like tones. So this is an example how they want to work with culture and work with the discussion of how is the culture in our workplace. Yeah. So that was this from now, and thank you for attention. Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, I just wanted to ask you, have you shared the part of your presentation with Jane? Because that, I think that, oh yes, I see Jane nodding, so great. Then I also saw in the list we had first Taj Salam, I hope that's correct pronunciation. I was guessed from ETF. And then I also saw that Alan was asking for the floor again. So, well, that's the, no, okay, so only Taj.
All right. Thank you very much, Leonardo. Thank you. I think we've had an excellent conversation on here today. I think we've got to actually pat ourselves on the back. We've come a long, long way. If we didn't do the work that we have been doing, then we would have found ourselves in a difficult situation. And why I say that is from our point of view, from the transport sector. I think you're all aware the transport sector is very male dominated. We were very, very, it was very hard for us to actually attract female staff, whether it was driving, whether it was conducting, or whether it was ticket selling. Now, ticket sellings in the stations were predominantly, but mostly it was the backroom staff that was actually mostly female staff. Now, when we talk about violence or discrimination or harassment, there's two types. One is the internal discrimination and harassment, and then there's the external in our sector. Now, the internal sometimes can be very, very sort of difficult for people to actually comprehend, because people know each other's movement, they know each other's shifts, they know much of the information that they may require about these people because they are colleagues. So, and the external harassment, we can actually sometimes nip it in the bud very, very quickly if we can identify the perpetrators. But internally, sometimes people are hesitant to actually report it. Now, I know Charlotte was saying about report it to your manager, but we find sometimes in some situations, it's maybe the manager that may be harassing or bullying or so we've got to be, we've got to create tools where people can feel confident about people reporting about people. So, and also the social media harassment. Nowadays, social media out there, everybody's got a phone that, Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, and all others that go with it. And that can also be very, very difficult and difficult situation for some people. They can be put in a very, very dangerous position. So therefore, I think confidentiality is the most important thing, that people can feel that at ease when they're actually reporting and there is no repercussions for them. That is the most important thing. We can have the best policies in the world. If there is no positive outcomes of those policies, then people will not buy into them. And we've also got to have the backing of the law. If somebody is proven to be guilty of doing things that they shouldn't be doing and it's making somebody else's life very difficult, then there's got to be repercussions for those people. Just by getting somebody rid of or dismissed or sacked from a job may not stop there. So we've got to have also channels that we can actually, people can go down that line. Now, we do have confidential reporting system where you can ring up and talk to people in a very confidential way, and your information will be kept confidential. Unless the case goes to court, your name may not be used at all. There's also then the counseling part of it. So people should actually be afforded counseling if they need to. And then, I think every company nowadays should actually appoint mental health champions, because people are suffering mentally very much through the pandemic. And then on top of that, if they are being harassed, bullied, or sexually harassed, then that also plays a very massive part of people actually breaking down. Now we do have, and a lot of the companies have actually started using app-based technology to dispense information to their employees. And I think we need to actually also, as representatives, as people who actually negotiate on behalf of the people, like myself as a trade unionist, we actually insist on having that information available to people at their leisure, so they can look at it at any time they wish to do so. We also have, dignity at work. Shala was saying that people may be talking about something. People might be actually saying something. We always used to have these jokes in the UK, Englishman, Scottishman and Irishman. Those jokes are outdated. We shouldn't be actually tolerating, any kind of jokes or any kind of speech where people, we degrade people. So therefore, I think dignity at work policies are also very, very important. So therefore, look, I'm not saying that we haven't come a long way. We've got still a long way to go to make sure that people feel comfortable when they get out, when they lock their front door to come to work, so they are not being harassed, they are not being bullied. And that's why I brought the managers part of it, because we find in many, many instances where people are bullied and harassed by managers, and they are very scared to actually say something until they absolutely break down. I hope that helps from our point of view. We at the ETF level, we have been looking at third-party violence. We have been looking at safeguarding issues at work. And we've got really good policies, and we want to work with organizations that actually do anything to make sure that people are actually safe and comfortable at their workplaces and their homes. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Taj. Thanks. And well, I would add, I think, another piece to our puzzle, because I think we are composing a very complex picture with all your interventions. Giving the floor to, I think it's Paula behind Nadia's name. Yes, it is. Please.
Thank you very much. Indeed, we are trying to simulate physical meeting by being two in the same room with masks. So yeah, I wanted to just report back a bit, because last week we had within another social dialogue project in local and regional governments, we organized a seminar on third-party violence in local and regional governments, and we had a number of examples from the ground, going from waste services to municipal police, firefighters. I know some of the people are also connected today. We had front desk workers, social services workers bringing forward their problems and what they face and what the local solutions that have been found on the ground. Also, we had a more political discussion last week, and I'll ask Leonardo to complement if I forget something. But I think one of the points was also, what do we do with the guidelines we have? We are assessing the guidelines that were done 10 years ago. We used them, how we used them, did we use them, and what do we do now with them? And I think this is also very much relating to the project that we are having today. From the conclusions, I think the social partners in local governments, so EPSU and CMR, both agreed that there is a need for a revision and update of those guidelines, especially for what it concerns online and digital violence. And I join the speaker that just spoke before me about the whole issue of social media, the whole issue of digitalization, the spike of use of digitalization with COVID, and so the more difficult in access of the services, especially when we come to local governments. So the feeling also of disconnection that people might have with their local community services. So the digitalization aspect is definitely something that we agreed that as a sector, we would see the need to discuss further and update the guidelines. The second aspect would be also a risk assessment and health risk assessment, and how that can be brought into the discussion a bit more. Also, we thought that it may be good also to revise a bit the wording and the language in case something has changed. For example, the ILO Convention 190 was not present when the guidelines were initially negotiated and adopted. So it's something that the new instruments, the new international instruments, and the new frameworks should be brought into this new discussion. I think a place for this discussion should also be about the effectiveness of the instrument. And I think we've seen, at least from our webinar, is that when an instrument is not binding, sometimes it's more left to the local, to find local solutions that might be disconnected with the European instrument. So in a way, I think it would also be worth it to see what kind of instrument we are looking into as a multi-sectoral project, and as social partners coming from different sectors, what would be needed, in which direction should we go? Because from our sector, it was clear the guidelines as they were negotiated in 2010, they had really good elements, but they need to be updated a bit, refreshed a bit with a number of topics. And I think it's worth it also to see with you all which way we should go forward. And I think we should start this discussion already now. Definitely, we didn't take a definite decision, I would say, but I would say that some from the unions, there were more perspective that should be more binding instruments. For this also guidelines, not necessarily being other guidelines, but maybe something more. But that is something that I think we should still discuss further and come up with an agreement and come up with a solution altogether. But just to update you, Jane was also there in the project. So this project was also presented in our other webinar last week. So the link is very clear. And if you want, we can make available the presentations also from that webinar to the participants of this webinar, so that there is more information also about the work in local and regional governments. Thank you.
Thanks, Paola. Well, I couldn't have said it better. So, well, I think, I mean, just as a general consideration, while maybe someone decide to take the floor, I mean, I see that I would say that mostly here, what we are discovering, identifying as a key issue is to find a good balance, a good mix between control and trust. A lot of the measures we have been talking about or presenting or mentioning are, I mean, playing on these two levels. It's either measure that allow employees to have more controlled situation environment at the workplace, but also it's a very, I mean, it's at the end of the day, it's an issue of trust, because if you don't trust your co-workers or your managers, well, even if there are all the right procedures into place, then these procedures become ineffective. So it's also about creating a culture of trust, which is not something you build up in overnight. And I think that's the main challenge we are identifying. And then we can, of course, decline this challenge into many aspects. For instance, the digital one that what Nadia or Paola just mentioned now. But this said, I'm wondering and still looking at the chat or at the screen. I don't see anyone else willing to speak for. Yeah, Jane, please.
Just, I mean, just in terms of the survey and some of the things that I'm picking up on the survey so far and some of the interviews I've done, I mean, what really stands out for me, Leonardo, and, you know, I think you're right, it is, you know, finding that balance between regulation, control and trust on the one hand, but also I'm finding most of the comments that are coming back from both trade unions and employers are for more detailed practical guidance. I think there's some very, very good provisions in the guidelines, You know, they're very comprehensive. There's a few things that need updating clearly, and we've raised those already, and particularly in relation to gender-based violence. But one thing I'm struck by is the number of comments that have been made about, you know, practical guidelines, what works, what can we do, you know, what are the things that work in practice. So it might be that there's some aspects of the guidelines that could lead to further, more detailed checklists, information, guidance of what works and so on. And I can see how that could certainly be done in the area of gender-based violence, you know, about creating complaint systems that work, you know, on third-party violence and harassment, because that's one of the issues that I know from, you know, other research studies, is that with the rise of third-party violence and harassment in the last decade, particularly, and we've seen that from, you know, the survey data, you know, people need something that they trust to report to, and for there to be learning about those incidents. And it's not, although it's a form of workplace violence, it doesn't come into the workplace grievance committee because it's somebody from outside of the workplace. So it challenges your systems for dealing with that, unless it's a serious case that goes directly to the police, in which case it becomes a kind of criminal justice issue. So I wondered whether, you know, that might be one way to approach some of the updating of the guidelines, is to just give some very practical information about what can be done, you know, helping people to think outside of the box a little bit, be innovative in terms of their solutions. I mean, I know from just what Charlotte was saying, for example, you know, the use of the cards that help people understand how to have conversations about difficult topics like sexual harassment, when people are coming from many different directions and understandings and perspectives.
Yes, indeed. That could be actually a good strength for development of the guidelines. Yes, I mean, because of course then we have also it's always come to that point when we have these joint European products, that we have to find something that is comprehensive enough and that can be applied in several member states, but at the same time that also is quite practical and precise, that actually it says something relevant to people on the ground. So it's that's the challenge we often have, but we are European social partners, so we are used to that. Simone, I think you wanted to intervene.
Yes, thank you, Leonardo. And I also would like to supplement what you said, that there's the differences between the member states, but it's also the differences between the sectors that we seeing that there are sectors that have more women in the sector compared to men, and the other way around. And so it's as you said, it's very challenging to find practical, very hands-on guidelines that can be applied on a multi-sectoral basis. Of course, there could be a potential to have, let's say, annexes or examples from other sectors, but like to create detailed guidelines that would be fitting every sector it will be very challenging. Nonetheless, maybe it's doable. I'm not being negative here, just realistic. And also, if we were asking about what we can do and how the guidelines have been used so far, yes, we have the survey that is being conducted now by Jane. Again, thank you very much for this, and everyone, please here, fill it out if you haven't done so yet. But I would like to draw your attention to also the implementation report that has been done, and I think it was already in 2013 or 14, where we had our first survey about what's being used and also how it's being used. So it's not that after 10 years, we suddenly start revising it. There's already something done. And I understand that there are some members here that have not been with their various organizations or even have signed up to the guidelines, but it might be worth checking out. I'm happy to send the link in the chat as well. So this will be really the first, my one concern. And also, and I already shared this with Leonardo in our chat, is the part where we talk about updating the guidelines, which is great, and so on, because we understand that there are issues on digitalization, the risk assessment, the gender perspective that has really advanced since the actual negotiation in 2010. But I would like to also draw your attention to the to the issue that not all the signatories are part of the project. So there are organizations that could not join this project due to various reasons. But if we were to really make the case and wanting to update the guidelines, it's not just the project partners that decide this and move on with this, but there's a broader picture that we have to consider when really wanting to revise the guidelines. So this is just to reflect upon. It's great that we want to do it, and I think it's really necessary, but it's not just the project partners and the members of the project partners to decide, it's also the other European sector social partners that have signed the guidelines that are not part of the project. Yes, but I see that also others have raised their hands, so I'm giving the floor to the colleagues. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Simone. And I just wanted to say that, I mean, I see in the chat a contribution from Eva Rodriguez from Spain, and well, also the point of Marcella about, well, promoting the guidelines to sectors that are probably not so well aware of them. Just wanted to say for the record that the chat itself will be recorded, so we won't lose track of it. Nadia, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, a couple of comments on how to go next. Because indeed the discussion we've just started now on whether and what to update in the guidelines is going to stay with us throughout the project. And well, it's true obviously what Simon just said, that not all signatory organizations are part of the project, but it's basically, I mean, it's one which is not part of the project. But obviously, formally speaking, if we were to update, to change the guidelines, even if that was a comma, we would obviously consult every signatory organization, and that would be done in any case, either within the framework of the project or after the project. But I think it's very useful beyond those formalities. What's very useful for us, and perhaps that's something we can think about for well, perhaps not for the next webinar, but for the midterm conference of the project on the 19th of November, is already to have some ideas. I think there is consensus, or seems to be consensus, regarding the importance and possibly the urgency given the reported increase of domestic violence, as was shown in Jane's presentation. So we do have something which is quite, dealing with that seems to be growing, whether it was specifically linked to the pandemic or not, but it's something we need to monitor as trade unions, obviously, and as employers, and find responses to. So what I would like to ask is to keep the different, the good comments being made regarding what, how we could update the guidelines in terms of taking better into account gender-based violence, and to continue the discussion on the 19th of November. And there will be also other topics possibly regarding how to make the guidelines useful. What I think would be also very useful from Jane, and I think we will have more information, is how come there are still many organizations that don't know much about the guidelines. And I think here again, there is a responsibility for social partners, both at EU level and national level, because if what we do in Brussels has no impact in Madrid or Stockholm or Bucharest, we need to wonder ourselves what is it we are doing. So we want, even if there are guidelines or autonomous agreements, we want what we do in Brussels to have some positive impact at the workplace. And I think so. From Jane, it would be useful to know, why there is still, there's still a low level of awareness regarding the guidelines. And of course, as Marcella said in the chat, that's already the starting point. And then amongst those, and you said, Jane, that it was a majority of trade union organizations that would like to make the guidelines, more binding. Was there any reasons given for that, to make them binding? Anyway, so I think again that's it's not good to conclude with questions, but we have this rolling out of our project for a few months still. So, but to keep, I think I would suggest to have one session on that at the midterm conference. And a very last thing, what was also underlined very much and is an issue is the under-reporting by employees of the problem of violence or harassment. But it's not just that, is when also they report back, there is sometimes no reaction from management. And I think we also need, and maybe it's actually easier to tackle, to make sure that whenever there is a report of such a serious matter, well, we need to know what the response is and what has been happening. And what we know is that sometimes there is zero reaction. And that obviously is the biggest deterring aspect for victims of violence. If there is no reaction, it actually adds even injury to insult, as we would say. Anyway, so it's also to keep that in mind, and I think that's something we can certainly work on. And that's it. We are past past 4, so thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. But that's actually true. I mean, I would only complement by saying that, well, as they say during the protest in the 68 Sénécan début, that's only the beginning. I mean, we are at the beginning of a process, and that's also one of the reasons why we are here today with this project. I mean, it's an effort that will be last for another year and a half, and I say effort in a positive way. It's a joint action, and I mean, I think we should indeed keep in mind that, besides revising the guidelines, learning more, we are also here to ensure that more and more people and organizations get to know and take up this challenge proactively at the workplace. And I don't see anyone else asking for the floor other than Jane. Then please.
So just one thing before we finish, please do complete the online survey. And if you haven't received the online survey, feel free to email me and I can email you the link, or else email the respective person in the organization that you're affiliated with. We'll try and do another sending out of the survey, but we really would encourage as many people as possible to complete it. So thank you very much.
Yes. Thanks. Yeah, that would be lovely indeed. And I just wanted to mention a couple of things before leaving you. The first one is that, as we said, we are in a project that's a process. So this is only the second webinar of a series of 7 in total. The next event that we plan in this project are indeed another webinar that will be focusing on risk assessment. It will be held on 25th of October and be facilitated by OSPIM. As you can see, we are doing a sort of rotating presidency. So next time will be OSPIM doing this. If Simone wants to indeed say anything, just feel free to intervene. Yes, you want.
Well, thank you very much for already appetizing a little bit what we are planning to do. So yes, indeed, the next one will be on the 25th of October. We will facilitate the webinar, and we are planning to invite speakers from, for example, the EWASHA, who have done an extensive work on risk assessment. You might know their tool, the EURA tool, which is an online interactive risk assessment tool, and we're really looking forward to having you there if you're interested in risk assessment.
Jag ska bara tysta och avsluta, så ska jag dra.
Nej, jag är ingen här. Förlåt. Thank you. And indeed, it would be great to have you all there, or also send the invitation once you receive them to your colleagues, if you like. And yes, we're really looking forward to having you on the 25th, most likely as well in the afternoon. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Again, you find the link to the survey in the chat. Then the next event of our project will be our conference on 19th of November. I was about to say in Madrid, but of course we are not sure at all we will manage to have a physical conference, I mean, in presence. So it might be an online event. We are in the process of defining this small detail. And well, and on this note, if there are no other questions or intervention, I would like to thank you all, to thank the speakers and the interpreters, last but not least, for having been with us, having well, allowed us to have these good exchanges today. And you will receive in the coming weeks a report of the discussions we had. So, well, at this point, I can only wish you a lovely weekend. Thanks a lot and bye.